But in order to take out the Book of Mormon, you've got to take out the witnesses somehow.
What is the reason that you think God chose to reveal the plates to witnesses rather than just let everyone come and see it?
The rumor that Martin Harris was one of James Strang's witnesses is bullcrap.
Which criticism or accusation would you say is the best?
Some of the witnesses, like David Whitmer, were still alive when people were claiming, oh, he only saw them with spiritual eyes.
Yes, they did claim to see the plates, but they all left the church.
If that is the best explanation that people can come up with to explain what is happening here, we're going to be fine.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Sword and Spirits. I'm your host, Daniel Sorensen, and today I'm joined actually by a new host. A few of you guys saw this announcement that we had some exciting news happening. So that exciting news is we have a new host. That new host is my friend, David Harper. David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing super good. Thanks, Daniel. Good to be here.
Awesome. Well, before we introduce today's guest, David, just quickly introduce yourself a little bit, what you do, and then after that, we'll introduce our guest for today.
Sounds good. So I'm David. I have been a lifelong member of the church. I served my mission in Richmond, Virginia. That's where I got interested in apologetics and online LDS content and scholarship. I'm good friends with Daniel. I'm currently a student at BYU, Idaho, studying history and hoping to go into grad school for biblical studies. And so I'm super excited to be here.
Awesome. So that's just a little bit about David. And so today we're going to be talking about the Book of Mormon witnesses, and we are joined by my good friend, David Snell. Before we jump into today's discussion, David, if you could just introduce yourself also, like who you are, your upbringing. Just a lot of people probably here know about you and might have seen your channel Keystone or the days where you were part of Saints Unscripted. But just very brief, or just for a minute or two, just talk a little bit about your upbringing and where you got to today, why you're doing what you're doing over at Keystone. Just go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit.
Sure. So I grew up in a small town in northeastern Oregon called Hermiston, and it was not a pretty place. It's kind of just it's the ugly side of Oregon, unfortunately, but we had some great people, and there are a lot of great people there. So I was raised around a lot of great people. I've been a member of the church my whole life. My parents have been members their whole lives. I graduated high school, went and served a mission in Chihuahua, Mexico for a couple of years. After my mission, I went to BYU. I studied communications with an emphasis in broadcast journalism at the time. I got married to my wonderful wife, and we have a couple of beautiful children now. And I guess mixed into all that, I started hosting on a YouTube channel called Saints Unscripted. And while I was doing that, we realized that people had a lot of historical questions about the church that were really hard to talk about in an unscripted fashion. So they were like, let's do a scripted segment of Saints Unscripted. The main show was still unscripted, but I was kind of put to the task of addressing tough questions head on. And so the scripted section of the show was called Faith and Beliefs, and I got to just study church history all the time while I was putting those videos together. And then that segment of the show eventually became Keystone, which is what I produce and host today. And yeah, I get to talk about and study and learn about church history pretty much all day. And I guess the caveat there is that I'm not a historian. I guess you could say I'm an amateur historian. But this is just it's just interesting to me. And I've learned a lot over the years, and happy to share some of the things I've learned. But I think that there are some pros and cons to that. On the con side, I have a little less authority, I guess, when I speak, because I don't have the degrees to back me up on some of these subjects. But on the plus side, I hope that I can be an example to other members of the church that anybody can get into this stuff and kind of digest it and come to their own conclusions about it. It's not just something that academics have access to, especially these days. with the advent of the Joseph Smith Papers project and things like that. So hopefully people can see that this is accessible stuff and that you can get into it and learn about church history. And so I'm excited to talk about that today.
Awesome. We're excited to have you. That was a great introduction, and we'll just go ahead and jump right in. So like I said to everyone watching, we're going to be discussing the Book of Mormon witnesses. But to start, some people will say, one of the things that people will say is, well, why the Book of Mormon witnesses? That's not overly impressive. Okay, people made eyewitness claims, but let's just start and discuss what makes the Book of Mormon witnesses unique. Why is this discussion or this topic's an important one to be aware of? Why should our viewer care about it?
Sure. So the way I see it, the claims of the Restoration are huge. Like, they're weighty claims, they're bold claims, and bold claims require extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence sometimes, right? And I know that, well, I'm a firm believer that when it comes to spiritual matters, God wants us to choose to believe, right? He's not necessarily going to overwhelm us with evidence that kind of forces us to believe. But he understands that we have kind of this logical, cognitive side of us that needs a reasonable foundation to support belief. And I think that that's what the witnesses provide. So, for example, if some guy, David, I'll use you in this example. If some guy walks in to your room behind you and says, "Hey, I found these golden plates. They're here in this box, but you can't see them. But they're there, and it's going to be this new set of scriptures." How are you going to react to that initially?
Well, I'm just gonna be weirded out. I'm like,
Yeah, it's going to be a
okay,
little
why are you
weird.
hiding it? Yeah.
Yeah, it seems a little sus, right? But then what happens if 11 other people come in and they're like, "Oh no, actually he does have this record that he says he has. I have seen it." Like, would that influence you at all?
Absolutely.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that he's telling the truth, right? But it makes it more complicated. It makes it more of a challenge to be able to dismiss offhand. And so what we have essentially is Joseph Smith saying, "Hey, I found these golden plates that this angel led me to." And initially, people weren't allowed to see them, right? And there are lots of reasons for that we could get into later if we want to. But and that's kind of what a lot of critics, I think, put emphasis on, is like, "Oh, he found these plates, but nobody else could see them. How convenient." But then we have these 11 guys that are like, "Well, no, actually, he showed them to us. We saw them." And in every copy of the Book of Mormon, I think in the first edition, these witness statements were in the back of the Book of Mormon, but in our current editions, they're in the front. You've got the testimony of the 3 and the 8 witnesses at the beginning of the Book of Mormon. It's not part of the revealed text per se. It's before the revealed text that these statements have been added to kind of give an introduction to what people are going to be reading. But you have their testimonies saying, so you got the 3 witnesses saying that an angel appeared and he showed us the plates. And then you've got the 8 witnesses saying, Joseph Smith, took us outside and he showed us the plates and we held them and turned the pages. They're real, And so you have to grapple with that somehow. You have to do something with that. You can't just say, "Oh, Joseph Smith made it up." It gets more complicated when there's this crowd of other people saying, "No, we saw him." Then you have to decide, are these conspirators that are lying with Joseph Smith, or did he somehow trick them? What's going on with these people? And then beyond the 11 witnesses, the 11 official witnesses you have in the Book of Mormon, you've got this other crowd of unofficial witnesses that had experiences with the plates. You've got Emma Smith that is having to move them around while they're covered as she's cleaning the house. And it's not like they're under lock and key. There's just like a cloth over, they're wrapped in a cloth, and she has to move them around as she's doing her housework. What is that? What is she moving around if they're not actually real? Like, is there a brick under there? Is it just a chunk of scrap metal, or what is it? You had one guy, I don't have the source on me immediately, but when Joseph Smith was first bringing the plates home after he initially got them, one guy says he saw a corner of them slip out from under the frock that they were wrapped in. And it's like, okay, what do you do with that? Like, people are having these experiences, and when you aggregate them together, it's like something's happening here, and we have to find an explanation that makes sense of the available evidence. And that is where the real challenge comes in. And it's a hurdle that I have not seen anyone adequately jump over yet. And so for that reason, I think the witnesses are extremely important. I think it's something that is often downplayed by critics, but also underappreciated by a lot of members. I've seen explanations that attempt to account for pieces of the evidence, but when we look at all of it together, it doesn't fit. You've got these witnesses who claimed that they were shown the plates by an angel. And so some people will say, oh, well, it was just a religious ecstasy. They were worked up in the spirit, and they had this unexplainable supernatural experience. That's what happened. That's how we explain it. But that doesn't explain the other 8 guys who were just like, yeah, Joseph Smith took us outside and he showed us the plates, and there was nothing supernatural happening at all. It's just like, here they are, And so while one theory might explain one situation, it fails to explain this other situation. And so the witnesses really add a lot of complexity to the claims that Joseph Smith is making. And the Book of Mormon is the keystone of our religion, right? Like, if you can take out the Book of Mormon, then so many other beliefs and claims just come toppling down. But in order to take out the Book of Mormon, you've got to take out the witnesses somehow. And I just haven't seen it happen yet.
Well, that's really awesome. Thank you for that overview, David. I like how you were emphasizing both the aspect of the believer side, where this provides like good, rational evidence that you can lean on, and also the critic side, where you have to account for or explain in a coherent way these witnesses. And so those both aspects I think are really important to emphasize. So that's really good. You mentioned a bit about how critics have proposed some sociological and psychological explanations, attempted to leverage these and explain the witnesses. And why do you find these unconvincing? And first of all, what are they, and why do you find them unconvincing?
Yeah, I find them unconvincing because they don't explain the big picture. If I'm looking at it from 50,000 feet, and I think that oftentimes they assume things that are not evident in the historic documents. So it's really easy to just claim, oh, people lie. The witnesses lied. And that's true that people can lie. But when you look at their statements and you look at their lives and you look at their testimonies, is there evidence that they lied? How do you back that up other than just wanting it to not be true? Other than just wanting the Book of Mormon to not be true. If you're going to claim that they lied, I feel like you need to substantiate it, and I don't see evidence to support that. But anyway, your question about some of the claims that people make to explain the witnesses and why I don't find them convincing. One of them is, all of these witnesses were either friends or family of Joseph Smith. It's like this tight-knit circle of friends. Of course, they could all be conspirators together, right? And I don't find that convincing for a few reasons. On the one hand, yes, you've got some of the 8 witnesses being like Joseph Smith's dad and brother, right? People that he's obviously grown up with and spent a lot of time with. But on the other hand, you've got a lot of these Whitmer brothers, and Hiram Page, who married into the Whitmer family. So Joseph Smith first met David Whitmer in either the end of May or the beginning of June 1829, when David Whitmer comes to pick up Joseph and Oliver Cowdery and bring them to his father's farm in Fayette, New York. So he meets David first, and David had been in communication with Oliver Cowdery a little bit beforehand, but this is the first time that Joseph is meeting David Whitmer, as far as I'm aware. He brings him to the farm where he meets the other Whitmers, John Whitmer, Christian Whitmer, Peter Whitmer Jr., I think. Yeah, Peter Whitmer Jr., and Hiram Page, who are some of the other 8 witnesses. So that would be probably the beginning of June 1829. Do you remember when they have their witness of the plates? It's literally a few weeks later. It's the end of June 1829. So like people are like, oh, Joseph Smith was just buddy with these Whitmers. He had known them for like less than a month when they had their witness. And so I asked myself, like, would I be willing to dedicate the rest of my life to a lie for someone that I have known for a matter of a few weeks? Probably not in my case, but that's exactly what they do. I mean, some of these Whitmers die pretty early. I think Christian Whitmer dies fairly early, but then you've got people like John Whitmer who live a very long life and never deny the veracity of what they experienced. And a lot of these individuals fall out with Joseph Smith, are excommunicated, or leave the church. And it's like, okay, at any moment, they could have said, you know what? I lied. Or, you know what? Joseph Smith duped me. Another one of the explanations is people say, well, they didn't want to admit that they lied because that would ruin their reputation, right? And it's like, one, if they cared that much about their reputation, they probably wouldn't have lied in the first place. So that's one issue I have with it. But two, if they were that worried, they could have easily just lied again and said, you know what? Joseph tricked me. I was ignorant. I was naive. I'm so sorry, guys, that I fell for this charade. But it's not true. But they don't say that. Like, they stick to their testimony throughout their entire lives. Perhaps my favorite story is about John Whitmer. And so he had left the church. He was separated from the church by 1839. And he was in Missouri at the time. And the Saints had been forced out of Missouri. But there's this guy named Theodore Turley who stuck around. He's a member of the church. He stuck around in Missouri to kind of settle some of the church's financial business and stuff like that. And so he's kind of alone. He's like one of the last Latter-day Saints there. And one day John Whitmer shows up with 5 other guys. And one of them is Samuel Bogart, who's just like an infamous anti-Latter-day Saint. And these guys start pressuring Turley to deny his testimony. Turley wasn't one of the witnesses, but he has a testimony of the Book of Mormon. They're like pressuring him to renounce it. And Turley turns to John Whitmer and asks John what he thinks about the Book of Mormon, because he knows that John Whitmer was one of the witnesses who's now a disaffected member. And John replies, I now say I handled those plates. There was fine engravings on both sides. I handled them. And then Turley asks him if he accepted the translation of the plates. So talking about the engravings on the record, John Whitmer says, I cannot read it, and I do not know whether it is true or not. So you've got this situation where one of the witnesses is surrounded by a hostile crowd of people that are pressuring Theodore Turley to renounce his testimony. And so then everybody turns to John, and he has to make the choice. Like, do I give up the Book of Mormon? How do I handle this? And the best he can do under those circumstances is say, I saw them. I know that I saw them, but I don't know what they said on them, you know? Maybe the translation is incorrect or whatever. But yes, I saw them. And it's like, okay, what do you do with that? How do you explain that when he had everything to gain by saying, no, it was all a sham? But instead he says, well, I saw them, but yeah, who knows what they said? Like, that just tells me that there's something really interesting happening here. And so it's things like that where it's like when people say, oh, they just lied. It's as simple as that. That's an example where I look at John Whitmer and I say, okay, I don't see the evidence to support that he lied. Like, even under this pressure, he's like, no, they were real. You see stuff like that where people are defending their testimonies throughout their lives and testifying of the Book of Mormon on their deathbeds. So there are lots of explanations that people give, but when you actually look at their testimonies, it doesn't hold water for me when you scrutinize some of these claims. And I'm sure we'll talk about more of them as we get farther into this interview, like the spiritualized claim, which is one of my favorites, which we can talk about right now, but I've been talking too much. So I'll turn it back over to you guys, and you can tell me which direction you want to go.
For sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is a good way to just transition kind of into like more specific claims that are made. I think you just discussed, of why certain witnesses, like for example John Whitmer, may not necessarily been like, okay, well this could have been a faulty translation, like could have been duped, but at least there were things on the plates. They were there. They weren't just non-existent. But I want to go into that like accusation that Joseph Smith duped certain people. For example, Martin Harris. Okay. When I look at certain criticisms against the witnesses, there are criticisms obviously against against David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery, but I think Martin Harris is the one usually most criticized, and for a big apparent reason. One of the things a lot of critics have said is that Martin Harris was prone to be gullible, that Martin Harris believed in a lot of superstitious things. And so a criticism because of that, they'll say, well, if I shouldn't take Martin Harris seriously on other things that he was gullible on, then why should I take him seriously when it comes to the Book of Mormon? After all, couldn't he have just been duped by Joseph Smith? Couldn't he just have been duped by Joseph Smith because he was prone to be deceived or gullible on these other things? What are your thoughts there?
I just ask how. Like, how was he duped? How did Joseph do it? How do you fake an angelic appearance? And Martin Harris's experience happens, a little bit of time during the same day after David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery have their experience, but their experiences match up. Like, they experienced the same thing. And so it's like, okay, if the assumption here is that Martin Harris was duped by Joseph Smith, one, how? And two, what about Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer, who did not have this, any kind of reputation of being gullible or dupable or naive or whatever? Again, you have to find an explanation that explains all three of them, and then all 11 of them together, and then the unofficial witnesses on top of that, and just saying Martin Harris was gullible. That's an easy claim to make, but a harder one to back up. Like, what did he experience then? And that's where a lot of people say, well, it was his spiritual eyes, right? He only saw it with spiritual eyes. And do you want to get into that claim? Because I got a lot to say about that one.
Yeah, go right. Just jump right in.
What does that mean, that he saw them with spiritual eyes? First of all, I'm going to make a couple of points here. One, we don't have a single firsthand account of Martin Harris saying, I saw them with spiritual eyes, right? These are all second or third hand accounts. I think all of them are hostile accounts, but don't quote me on that. You'll have to go back and check. So there are reasons to question the sources that are saying, oh, he only saw them with spiritual eyes. But the second point I want to bring up is, even if he did actually say that he saw them with spiritual eyes, what does that mean? Because a lot of people will just jump to the conclusion, oh, that means it wasn't real. That means it was his imagination. That means it didn't actually happen. And I would challenge that assumption. for a couple of reasons. One, if we go to our own scriptures, in Moses chapter 1, Moses sees God face to face in a vision. And after that vision, we read, "Mine own eyes have beheld God, but not my natural, but my spiritual eyes. For my natural eyes could not have beheld, for I should have withered and died in his presence." So in our scriptures, we've got this example of seeing with spiritual eyes. Now, I'll ask you guys, does that mean in Moses chapter 1 that Moses didn't actually see God, that he only imagined it? It doesn't really seem that way, right?
Yeah. No.
Yeah, it said face to face.
Yeah, he says, "Mine own eyes have beheld God." Not my natural, but my spiritual. Because if they were my natural eyes, I would have withered and died in his presence. So we believe that some kind of sanctifying or purifying change has to happen to our bodies to enable us to be able to view some of these holy things, like the face of God, right? And I think that's a pretty widespread understanding within Christianity, is that you can't be in the presence of God in your natural state without just dying or whatever. So that's one example of this phrase, like seeing with your spiritual eyes, that I don't think means it was imagination. But then also, if we, I had a fascinating study on this a couple of years ago, looking at how this phrase spiritual eyes was used in the 1800s, around the era of Martin Harris. And so, for example, I found in a commentary of the Bible on in Numbers 22, and this is from a book from 1867. I'll even tell you the name of the book right now. It's called "From Egypt to Canaan, being the divine description of the regenerate life shewn by Israel in Egypt, blah, blah, blah. Sermons by, I believe, Jonathan Bailey in 1867. It's talking about Numbers 22. It's talking about Balaam and his donkey, right? When he's riding on his donkey and the donkey suddenly won't move. And he gets mad at the donkey, and then he sees an angel standing in their path, right? In this book, he says that Balaam sees this angel with spiritual eyes. And the author goes on to say, whenever an angel is seen, we may be assured that it is with spiritual eyes. But, end quote, but in this example, like, is this angel imaginary? Is it just visionary? No, because it's actually physically blocking the path of this donkey, right? So he's saying he's seeing it with spiritual eyes, but he's not meaning that it's not actually there. He's just saying he's seeing it. He's seeing spiritual things with spiritual eyes, but they are real things. Another example, this one is coming from a different book, and it's a commentary on 2 Kings, where the prophet Elijah is praying that his servant's eyes may be opened to see an army of angelic chariots that are protecting Elijah from a nearby Syrian army. So this is an 1890 commentary, and it rephrases Elijah's prayer, and it says, enable him, talking about Elijah's servant, about his prayer about his servant, enable him to see with his spiritual eyes the great realities around him. Nothing was created or changed for him. The heavenly host were really there, but unperceived, as the stars are in the heavens and the flowers in the field, though the blind man sees them not. So it's another example of people in this era saying, Elijah's talking about seeing with your spiritual eyes reality, the realities, the spiritual realities around him. And so my question is, if our own scriptures and even non-Latter-day Saint Bible commentaries are using the phrase spiritual eyes in ways that do not mean imaginary, if we accept that these other uses are fine and don't mean imaginary, why is it that when Martin Harris uses the same phrase, we automatically assume that he just imagined everything and that it wasn't real. Like, it seems to me, based on the other statements from the witnesses and from Martin Harris himself, that he believed that this was a real physical experience, even if he at some point said that he saw them with spiritual eyes.
Well, real quick, David. You know that
Yeah.
reminds me. I mean, obviously this is talking about Martin Harris, but just what you're talking about reminds me. I believe it was an interview with David Whitmer where he just actually discusses a little bit that, and I think it's probably one of the best explanations for the idea of spiritual eyes. So this is an interview, I believe, with Anthony Metcalf, and where David Whitmer says, "Of course, we were in the spirit when we had the view, for no man can behold the face of an angel, except in spiritual view. But we were in the body also, and everything was as natural to us as at any time." So I think that specific statement just puts it out there that this is, you know, in order to see supernatural or the divine, spiritual things, spiritual eyes is a scriptural term that is used to be able to see those things. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Well, you bring up a great point that, like, some of the witnesses, like David Whitmer, were still alive when people were claiming, oh, he only saw them with spiritual eyes, and they responded. So I'm glad that you brought that source up, because I think people don't often realize that, like, they knew that these claims were in the air, and David Whitmer addressed it and was like, yeah, we saw it with spiritual eyes because you can only see spiritual things through the spirit. But we were really there. It really happened. And I mentioned before that you also have to take some of these statements within the wider context of other things that the witnesses also said. So, for example, you also have Martin Harris saying, this is from an interview with Ollie A. Jensen. He said, "The prophet Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer and myself went into a little grove to pray to obtain a promise that we should behold it with our natural eyes, that we could testify of it to the world." But it's interesting here. There's a word that's crossed out. He says, to pray to obtain a promise that we should behold it with our, and then there's the word eyes, and it's crossed out, and then it says natural eyes, that we could testify of it to the world. So it's like he's aware of these claims that people are making that it was only imaginary or whatever. So he, like, intentionally makes an attempt here to say, no, it was with our natural eyes, or it was reality, I guess, is probably the emphasis that's trying to be made here. I don't know if that is Martin Harris verbatim that said that, or if this is just how it was copied down by the person who was recalling the interview, but I think it's noteworthy. And there are other examples of Martin Harris emphasizing the reality of what happened. There's another recollection. This is a later recollection of an interview. But it says, "Gentlemen, do you see that hand? Are you sure you see it? Are your eyes playing a trick or something? No. Well, as sure as you see my hand, so sure did I see the angel and the plates. Brethren, I know I saw and heard these things, and the Lord knows I know these things of which I have spoken are true." So it's like, oftentimes when some critics or skeptics might talk about the witnesses, sometimes the only statements they will bring up are these few statements about, oh, they only saw it with spiritual eyes. But I have one, I think there's a rational, reasonable explanation for the whole spiritual eyes phrase. But on top of that, I have over 60 other statements from the 3 and the 8 witnesses, and I keep them on Keystone's Instagram account in their story highlights. And I just keep them there because I want people to know, like, these people saw them, and you can read their statements. And I just have story highlight after story highlight of, here's what they said, here's the source. You can go through all 60 plus of them. I think it's almost 70 now. Make sense of these things for me, right? Like, you can't just say, oh, there are a couple second or third hand statements about spiritual eyes, even though people use that term to describe real things, and ignore these other 60 statements that they made that are much more realistic or much more grounded in reality, even though I think the spiritualized term is still grounded in reality. Anyway, so I think that that is one of the best or most common counterpoints to the witnesses, but I still think that it's not very good and doesn't hold up under scrutiny from my perspective. I understand why people might be quick to accept it because it's a quick way to just like sidestep the whole witness, category. But for me, it does not answer the questions that need to be answered for me to be able to just explain or dismiss what these people experienced.
Yeah, that's great. And for everyone watching, we'll be sure to link that little Keystone page so you can see that. Another book that really tackles a lot of these questions that people have is Richard Anderson's Investigating the Book of Mormon Witnesses.
Yep. Hey, yours is a lot nicer than my copy.
Well, mine is I think only 2 or 3 years old. So, but great books. So I'll be sure to link that book on either Amazon or something like that, and in our description. But that's a great for just to get a comprehensive understanding of the witnesses. That's a great book. I believe it was. When was the book written? I think it was in the.
I think it was the 80s.
70s, 80s, yeah. And the arguments, or not necessarily arguments, but the research done with it is still, I would say, holds up to this day. And so for those of you that are curious, that's a great book to start. But we'll go ahead and keep moving on. David, you got a question?
Yeah, so I just love how you were situating that whole spiritualized within its broader, 19th century context, and how the same criticism that we hear about that was also leveled at them while they were still alive. I just find that really funny how it just comes full circle. But I was wondering, another common criticism that's leveraged by usually folk that are like less informed than usual is one. Well, they'll say, well, yes, they did claim to see the plates, but they all left the church. Why is that kind of actually makes the claim stronger rather than weaker? And can you give us some context for maybe why they left the church? And is that misleading in any sense to say that?
It completely backfires, right? Because you would expect them to be hostile towards the church. You would expect them to be hostile towards Joseph Smith. But they double down and they say, I have problems with the church. I have problems with Joseph Smith. But yes, the plates are real. Like, we saw them. Matter of fact. And so it's one thing when people that are supportive of the church and the mission of the church, it's one thing when they claim something. But then when you even have enemies of the church saying, no, yeah, they're real, that I think is even more powerful. And they left for various reasons, or they were excommunicated for various reasons. One of the big ones for the Whitmers was just disagreement with Joseph Smith on just how administrative things were being handled in the church and finances and whatnot. I think there were a lot of people who left in the later 1830s, 1837, 1838, with the Kirtland Safety Society issue. And I think that David Whitmer was kind of wrapped up in that. And this brings me to another rationale that people bring up about why the witnesses aren't trustworthy. There's a quote from David Whitmer where he says, at one point he leaves the community of Latter-day Saints after he had been separated from the church itself. He says, just as I know that the plates are real, I'm paraphrasing, but he says something along the lines of, just as sure as I am about my testimony of the golden plates, I know that God told me to leave the church, separate from the saints. And people say, oh, well, if you guys believe him about the plates, you should believe him about this, about what he says about the church. And my response to that is, I do. Because he doesn't say the church is false. He doesn't say that it's, it's all a fraud. He says that God told him to separate. And at the time, the saints were pretty hostile towards David Whitmer, to the point where they were on the verge of warning him out of town which was just how people in the 19th century, they would just intimidate people until they left town. And so I have no doubt that God told David Whitmer, yeah, you should probably separate from this group for now because things are getting a little heated. But that doesn't at all mean the church isn't true or that his witness of the Book of Mormon is true. So that's another explanation that I don't think holds a lot of weight. But we haven't, I'm sorry, I'm going back a little bit because we haven't talked about my favorite one yet. Because we know that there has to be an explanation for all of the evidence, right? Not just a piece of it. You got to take all of it and figure out, okay, if this is a fraud, what is happening here? And I find it so telling that I have it behind me, but I won't get it. In works like Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History, or later works by critics that are still alive today, like Dan Vogel, it seems that the best explanation that at least those two well-known critics have been able to come up with is that Joseph Smith somehow hypnotized the witnesses or caused them to hallucinate. I believe Fawn Brody says that Joseph Smith had the ability to unconsciously hypnotize people. Like, he wasn't meaning to, but unconsciously, he just did it. He just made them see things that were not there. And Dan Vogel seems to agree that it was some kind of hallucination imposed upon them. If that is the best explanation that people can come up with to explain what is happening here, we're going to be fine. You know, because that is like, I'll do respect to those people. I don't want to disparage them, but that explanation for me is pretty laughable, just because of how unrealistic it is. And the idea that, like, Joseph Smith could unconsciously produce a shared hallucination that these people would invest their entire life into is just, I've never heard of that happening, particularly in the 1800s, and particularly on accident or unconsciously. And so it's just like, if the Book of Mormon is not true, there's an explanation for it, right? Like, there has to be a rational explanation that explains all of these things. And if the best explanation is hypnotism, it's like, okay, yeah, you gotta find something better than that for me. Again, I'm not saying people have to believe. I don't want to disparage people that have issues with church history or questions about it. I totally get that. But for me, like, the witnesses, like, you gotta grapple with them, you know? Like, you can say Joseph Smith was a pedophile with 40 wives or whatever. Like, you can make all those claims. That doesn't explain to me the witnesses or what they went through, or how the Book of Mormon came to be. And that is really important for me to know, for me to figure out if I'm ever going to leave my faith behind.
Yeah. Well, let's continue talking about that, because, for example, a critic that might be listening to this episode might say, well, Oliver Cowdery did recant his testimony. Well, there is an account by Thomas Ford where he talks about how Oliver Cowdery was interviewed or joined a Methodist church, and in this he either denied, or his specific words were, he was ashamed with being part of Mormonism in any way. And obviously this was after Oliver Cowdery's death, but Thomas Ford goes on to discuss how, well, Oliver Cowdery basically recanted his testimony here because he said that he was ashamed of the Book of Mormon, or ashamed of Mormonism, and he was ashamed of any part. The specific wording that was used in the source. So it says Oliver Cowdery did join a Methodist Protestant congregation in Tiffin for a time. Then an affidavit from Methodist leader G.J. Keane claimed Cowdery said that he was sorry and ashamed with his connection with Mormonism. And, Thomas Ford, in his book, A History of Illinois, discusses that a little bit, how, well, that was Oliver Cowdery denying his testimony of the Book of Mormon. What are your thoughts there? Do you think that's, like, very good, or you're like, that's... Go ahead.
I just think that's a jump. If somebody's saying, I'm ashamed of my involvement in the church, and taking that to mean that I specifically deny that I ever saw the Book of Mormon, I think that's a jump. But also, if I'm going to have to look into this, but Thomas Ford, if I recall correctly, you said it's History of Illinois?
Correct.
So I think in that same book, he gives a history of the 8 witnesses, and maybe you guys have read this. Maybe you can confirm or deny this for me. It's been a while since I've seen it. But he writes about the 8 witnesses, and I have no idea where he's getting his information from. First, he writes about the 3 and the 8 witnesses. I think he gets at least some of the names wrong of the 3 or the 8 witnesses. I think he got Oliver Cowdery's name wrong. I'll have to look it up, though. Second, with the 8 witnesses, I believe he says that they were like inside for hours and hours praying to be able to see the plates, and Joseph Smith opened up a box and it was empty, and the witnesses were like, I don't see anything, there's nothing there. And Joseph was like, oh, we didn't pray hard enough, keep praying. And he's like trying to work them up into a religious fervor. Like, his account of what happened is so foreign from all of the other accounts that we have. I don't know where he's getting it. I think he's making stuff up, frankly. I think he's just like, oh, I think one time I think this was how it went, and he just kind of fills in the blanks, not even getting some of their names right. And so when it comes to Thomas Ford, I have issues with him and his credibility. Is that ringing a bell for you guys? Have you read that account?
I haven't read that account. I've heard of that account, but I haven't read that. I haven't specifically read that account. I mean, but it doesn't necessarily. I mean, that does, raise specific issues about his credibility. But I'd also just add this statement. I'm not saying it's necessarily inaccurate. Okay, I think it's a stretch to say that was Oliver Cowdery denying his testimony. But whereas, with David Whitmer, who certain accusations would be made against the witnesses, and he would basically respond and say, no, that's not the case. Well, what we saw was real. It was not imaginary. It wasn't. We weren't, hypnotized at all. It was It was true and it was real. But I think one of the things to just be a note is the idea of first, second, and third-hand sources. So Thomas Ford is working off of a second-hand source. So Thomas Ford is saying this himself is a third-hand source. And I'm not saying that second or third-hand sources are not credible at all. But generally, when we're looking and doing research, first-hand sources are typically our go-to for the available information to get. Okay, what was the most probable thing that was said? Okay, was this what they said here? Was it how probable is it that this was said, and in the context surrounding that? If we don't really have first-hand sources available, then second-hand sources are our best go-to, but we should be a little bit more cautious just because it's not first-hand. And then you get to third-hand, fourth-hand. So for example, for people listening, I may tell David Snell something, and then David Snell may tell David Harper what I told him, and then David Harper would tell someone else. And the further and further along that this information gets, the less accurate it's going to be, unless I have it in writing and I give it, and then David gives it to David, and David gives it to someone else. So that's kind of a little idea of why these things may not necessarily be inaccurate, but one, this was made after Oliver Cowdery's death, and two, it was made by someone that did not know who the witnesses were, other than it seems to be stuff that he heard. So I think it's important just to be aware of that.
Yeah, I found my where I was getting this information from, because we did an episode on this a while back, and I included a note in the YouTube description of the episode, because Fawn Brody in No Man Knows My History actually quotes Thomas Ford from History of Illinois. So, according to Ford, Joseph Smith had the witnesses pray for hours before getting them in a room and showing them an empty box. When those present said they didn't see any plates, Joseph apparently responded that they needed to pray harder for faith and forgiveness. Then they were now persuaded that they saw the plates. The list of things wrong with Ford's retelling of this is very long, but his only, to wrap things up a little bit, his only source for this information, I guess sources for this information are anonymous, quote, men who were once in the confidence of the prophet, end quote. We don't know who that is. We have no idea where he's getting this information. The stories from the actual people involved are very different from these people who were once in the confidence of the prophet, whoever those people are. And as a funny side note, on the previous page on Thomas Ford's book, I was right in remembering that he didn't even get the names of the three witnesses right. He writes, so he says Oliver Cowdery, not Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris he gets right, and Daniel Whiteman. Not David Whitmer, it's Daniel Whiteman. They solemnly certify that we have seen the plates which contain the record. And so it's just like, the vibe I get from this is like, I just saw a video earlier this morning of somebody talking about the founder of the LDS Church, John Smith. And every time I hear that, I think, oh, the guy from Pocahontas, right? Like, if you can't even get the name Joseph Smith right, if you can't even get Oliver Cowdery right and David Whitmer, not Daniel Whiteman and Oliver Cowdery, like, I'm sorry, but that raises questions about your credibility and several red flags in my mind. And so I think that Thomas Ford had a bone to pick with the church and didn't mask that very well in his writings. But yeah, I don't put much weight on what he has to say about the witnesses.
Awesome. That's great. And I think that's really, I think that's really just kind of establishing the issues with certain critic statements, because oftentimes that's something that I've heard before, where someone will mention these sources but won't dive into the sources to see how, are they good sources to learn from, or are they sources that are like, the credibility is not really the best, especially when you can't get the people's names right.
Well, and I just think that even if it's true, even if Oliver Cowdery was like, yeah, I regret being associated with the church, it's still a stretch to say he denied his testimony of the Book of Mormon. If that is the best source that people have that suggests any kind of denial, again, I think I think the witnesses are still a formidable obstacle. But I could see Oliver Cowdery saying, hey, I had issues with polygamy. I had issues with Joseph Smith and the financial administration of the church, and I regret being involved for that reason. I could see him saying that. But that does not mean he denied his testimony of the Book of Mormon. And you have David Whitmer saying, and I don't have the exact quote on me, but he says, I'm not aware of any example from the other witnesses at any time of them denying their testimony of the Book of Mormon. And we all have other quotes from Oliver Cowdery reaffirming his testimony. And so I think that when you hear something like what Thomas Ford is saying, you have to also measure that against these other statements that we have from Oliver Cowdery or about Oliver Cowdery, and allow those to inform each other to kind of make a judgment call on how reliable the sources are. Just because, and you kind of mentioned this, just because there is a historical source that says something doesn't mean it's true. You have to be careful with where they're coming from and what their motivations are. And that applies to positive statements as well. People talking about good things about the church too. The street goes both ways. You have to be careful with your sources and have to analyze them with care.
Yeah, it goes into what I call, with these type of things, for people that are looking to get into more, scholarship, there's a term I use, and I said, and it's don't engage in fast food scholarship or fast food apologetics. That goes for the critics and for the believer. Don't just just don't just reject something because it's uncomfortable and or it doesn't seem to align with what you previously thought. But at the same from the critic's perspective, do your research, and don't purely just rely on Fawn Brody for your research. But one of the questions that I have now is, we've talked a bit about kind of the responses and responding to specific criticisms or accusations against Joseph. But a question I wanted to ask is there a certain argument or a certain criticism or accusation that you feel like is the strongest out of all of the accusations or the criticisms that are used against Joseph or the witnesses, that you feel like is probably the best one, even if you don't find it even if you don't find it convincing? Do you think which criticism or accusation would you say is the best?
I think that your best shot is to go the route of, oh, they were worked up in some religious fervor and really, really wanted to see the plates, and so they just convinced themselves in their religious ecstasy that they did see them. I think that's probably, I don't know, the best naturalistic explanation, even though I think it's still crap, frankly. Just because there's no evidence of that. Like, the three witnesses, like, they said a prayer in the woods. They weren't, freaking out in some religious fervor. They were just praying, and they had the angel come and show them the plates. But then the 8 witnesses, like, contrary to what Thomas Ford has to say about it, as far as we know, Joseph just gets them together and says, all right, let's go to this spot where my family used to pray outside in Palmyra. But I don't even think they pray. They go there, and Joseph is like, ha, voila! He removes the cover or whatever, or the box, takes them out of the box, and is just like, here they are. And they're like, yes, indeed, there they are. Cool. Let me turn the pages. Let me hold them. It's like, okay, I don't see a lot of religious fervor going on there, but if you're looking for like a good reason, I mean, not a good reason, if you're looking for an easy way to shrug them off and you want to ignore the available evidence, I think a lot of people look on the 1800s like this kind of religiously exciting time, and so I think that they could probably just lump the witnesses in with that and just chalk it up to religious fervor and kind of wash their hands with it and be done. I can't do that, but I think a lot of people do.
Yeah, no, it's the Second Great Awakening, right? So everyone's just having visions and miracles everywhere. Yeah, no. But I guess I had more of like a philosophical, theological question relating to the witnesses that I've thought about a little bit. How come do you think, like, what is the reason that you think God chose to reveal the plates to witnesses rather than just let everyone come and see it?
I think that the golden plates are sacred. I think that they represent a sacred Nephite relic, similar to the tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments that were kept in the ancient Israelite tabernacle. And in the ancient Israelite tabernacle, only the high priest was allowed to see those things, right? And I think similarly, Joseph Smith, similar to a high priest, was the only person allowed to see the plates for some time. But I think that, well, one, the Book of Mormon prophesies of witnesses being able to see the plates, which also, like, how gutsy would that be for Joseph Smith as a fraud to put that in the Book of Mormon before it happened? Like, writing in the Book of Mormon, oh, by the way, these plates will be revealed to these 3 people. He doesn't name them by name in the Book of Mormon, but they're going to be revealed to 3 people. And then he's just, like, counting on his ability to unconsciously hypnotize 3 people into seeing these plates. It's like, that's a gutsy move, and you got real lucky if you are a fraud that these people bought into this whole story on your first try, or whatever. There's a pattern in that. I mean, the apostles did the same thing, right? They witnessed of what they saw and heard from the life of Jesus. You know, we know about Jesus's resurrection because of the witnesses, and that's pretty much it. Like, there's no other evidence other than the records we have from people saying, "Yeah, we saw him." And I think that God chooses witnesses because it provides people with a choice to believe. There's some logic involved and some rationale, but not so, the evidence is not so overwhelming that they have no other choice but to believe. People can look at the evidence and the witnesses and come to their own conclusions. And some people are going to say, yeah, I believe them. And some people are going to say, I don't buy it. But I think that God structures these kinds of things so that we are able to use our agency and choose to believe, not because we are overwhelmed by the academic evidence, but because our hearts and minds resonate with the truths being presented. I think God wants us to choose him because of that, and not because 2 + 2 = 4, and we have all of the evidence available before our eyes, and so, well, we better accept it because otherwise God's going to punish us or whatever. I think he wants us to choose him because we want to.
I love that. Just real quick, you were referring to the witnesses of the resurrection, okay, and like that's how basically one of the ways that we can even remotely test if those statements even remotely happen. But one of the things that we have, obviously, the Book of Mormon witnesses. We have 3, 8, and then we have other witnesses that either say that they felt the plates, or, for example, you have Mary Whitmer. It's secondhand, but you have a source saying that Mary Whitmer said that she saw an angel and the plates while she was milking a cow. But one of the questions I have for that is, okay, so for those that don't know, after Joseph's death, there was someone that put forth that he should be the president or the prophet of the church. This man, his name was James Strang. James Strang said that he had some plates, and that he had his own witnesses for the plates. And if I remember correctly, I may not remember this correct 100% correctly, but I believe Martin Harris was also a witness for these plates. So the question arises, okay, why should I take the Book of Mormon witness seriously if James Strang said a similar thing? But why should I believe Joseph Smith's claims over James Strang's claims?
The rumor that Martin Harris was one of James Strang's witnesses is bullcrap. It's not true. James Strang had 11 witnesses as well for his plates. And I have their names right here. Aaron Smith, Jira B. Whelan, James M. Van Nostrand, and Edward Whitcomb. Those are the four of his witnesses. The other 7 are Samuel Graham, Samuel P. Bacon, Warren Post, Phineas Wright, Albert N. Hosmer, Ebenezer Page, and Jehiel Savage. Martin Harris is not on that list. He was not one of the official witnesses, at least, of James Strang's plates. He did for a time support James. I don't know if I'd say support. He went on a mission for James Strang's sect, and he came home after about 6 weeks. His companion escorted him home, and I believe the reason was that he was only willing to testify of the Book of Mormon and not really testify of James Strang and his authority as a prophet. So I think that his willingness to associate with Strangism had more to do with the Book of Mormon than James Strang. He was not one of Strang's official witnesses. And it's interesting because I did a study about Strang's witnesses, and there are a few poignant differences. One, None of them ever see an angel. They are not presented Strang's plates by an angel, unlike the 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon. That's significant. But 2, I had a very, very hard time finding follow-up statements from any of these witnesses throughout their lives saying, yes, it's all true. I don't deny my testimony. It seems like they put their name to this one instance and then like they never really talk about it again. And I will say that when they say, oh, I saw James Strang's plates, I believe them because James Strang had plates. The question is about the authenticity of the plates he had. And by comparison, James Strang's plates were a lot smaller and a lot shorter in length. I believe, what is it called? The something Raja, the Raja Manchu plates, or the Vori plates. We talk about these plates as if they're comparable to the plates that Joseph Smith had. James Strang's plates were a tiny set of 3 plates. Like, they're like, I think they were like a little bit bigger than like a chicken and a biscuit cracker, each of the plates. Like, they're small, and they had some like drawings on them. He reveals, so what happened is he had these 3 plates, and then I think that there were 4 witnesses of those plates, and then years later he reveals another set of plates to the 7 witnesses that are purportedly the brass plates of Laban mentioned in the Book of Mormon. Anyway, so there are some big differences between the Book of Mormon witnesses and James Strang's witnesses, and we've done a whole episode on, actually a few episodes on that before, because I think it's just a fascinating topic, especially when you get into the journals of James Strang and the specific and slightly red flag raising ambitions that he had ever since he was a young man. But anyways, I'm not concerned with Martin Harris's affiliation with James Strang. It had more to do with the Book of Mormon than anything else, and he was not one of the official witnesses of any of Strang's plates.
Awesome. That's sweet. And we'll be sure to link, just again, like we've talked about throughout this episode, these resources in our description below for today's episode. We are running a little bit low on time, so but this has been a great discussion. I think this has been great, and I highly recommend people check out the resources that are going to be below, because this is just a fascinating discussion, and it is one of the things that really bolsters, I would say, the true claims of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the restoration, and especially, I would say, if you are evangelical and you take the resurrection seriously, and you say, well, we have eyewitness testimony for the resurrection, okay? We also have eyewitness testimony for the claims of the restoration, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and it deserves to be treated seriously and not just dismissed. So for people that are Christian, evangelical, Catholic, if you're going to argue against the restoration claims, then I would say to please take these accounts seriously and not just dismiss them, because if not, then you're having a double standard. And if you have a double standard, then it's hard to have those kind of conversations with you. But this is something I think that needs to be taken seriously. So, but since we are running a little bit low on time, David, if there's something, just one thing in specific that you would hope someone would get out of today's discussion, today's episode, what would that be? What would be the biggest takeaway for someone listening from today's discussion?
Yeah, I think you just nailed it, actually. I hope that people take these witnesses seriously. It doesn't mean just because there were witnesses of Christ's resurrection and there were witnesses of the golden plates, that doesn't mean you have to believe both sets of witnesses. Like, there are witnesses of Joseph Smith plates and witnesses of James Strang's plates. And, well, actually, I guess I believe both of those witnesses as well, because James Strang had plates, though I don't believe in the authenticity of them. But, like, each situation is different, right? Like, you have to analyze the sources and come to your own conclusions. And so I understand that some people are going to look at the witnesses of Jesus Christ's resurrection and be like, yes, I believe that, but not believe this other thing. But when it comes to the Book of Mormon witnesses, I think that people who are unfamiliar with them or unfamiliar with our faith or not really motivated to learn more, I think there's a phenomenon where they probably hear one common argument against the witnesses and be like, okay, that's it. Got my answer. Like, it's all a fraud. Spiritualize, or, hallucinations or hypnotism or whatever. Or they were in on it, or whatever it might be. But I hope that people take the time to actually read their statements and to take them seriously and to try to I don't want to tell people to like find a reason not to believe, but like if you have an explanation, let me know, right? Like if you can explain the body of evidence that we have, let me know, because I would want to know. But take it seriously and give it some thought and give it some prayer and look into the sources and come to your own conclusions.
Awesome. That's a great closing. David, thank you so much for being on today just to discuss some of the research that you've done on this and just the information that is just widely available. So just first off, thanks for coming on today. And for everyone listening, again, we'll be sure to link all the things we talked about in our description. But for everyone listening, this has been another episode of Sword and Spirit, and we'll see you all next week. Take care.